this episode of Newt's World, we're going to look at somebody who dealt head-on with student unrest on college campuses. I was very struck when I watched the rebellion against America spread from campus to campus, students occupying buildings, and I was reminded that we went through all of this 56 years ago, that we had, in fact, the students at Columbia occupy Hamilton Hall on April 30th, 1968, and 56 years later, on the same day, pro-Palestinian activists took over Hamilton Hall again. Now, we've seen protests erupt in, I think, 24 different states on 44 campuses. Several thousand students have been arrested and non-students, as we're discovering at this stage, and I suspect this is far from being over. And I was just reminded of the most famous confrontations involving students trying to take over and shape society by dominating their campuses, and that was starting with Berkeley in the 1960s. And the person who stood up against the campus protests was Governor Ronald Reagan. And so I want to devote this podcast to Governor Reagan and how he dealt with student unrest, both as a candidate and then as governor of California. I think there are a lot of lessons that today's university leaders and political leaders could learn by studying what Governor Reagan did. The governor's campaign, when he began in 1965, against presumably a very popular incumbent who had defeated Richard Nixon in 1962 by over 1 million votes, Edmund Pat Brown. His son later, Jerry Brown, became governor. And Pat Brown was seen as very tough to defeat. And that was a period when actors weren't in the habit yet of running for office. And so Reagan's advisors, who included the most famous consulting firm in California, decided that he had to go out and do town hall meetings and answer questions and prove that he knew enough to be governor. Now, the way they developed that is they had a large shoebox filled with 4x6 cards, and each card represented an answer on an issue. Reagan, being a professional actor, could memorize the entire shoebox with amazing speed, and so he was ready. He goes out to the first town hall meeting, and the audience asks him about Berkeley. Wasn't one of the cards. And he goes back and he tells the consultants, and they say, oh, that's not really an issue. Then he goes to the second town hall meeting. And once again, first question, what are you going to do about Berkeley? And he doesn't have an answer in the cards. He gives his instinctive answer, which became what he did for the rest of the campaign. Goes back and sees his consultants, and they say, we really don't think it's an issue. And he has this great line where he says, look, if they think it's an issue, we think it's an issue, because they get to define what the issues are. And that also reflected Reagan's whole attitude for his presidency, that it was the people who mattered, and you had to know what the people wanted. But let's listen for a second. In a June 16th, 1969 KQED News interview, Reagan described what had happened and how it became an issue.
Let's just straighten the record on something. The people of California made this an issue. I did not. I campaigned in the primary on a basis of question and answer in every public appearance. I opened myself being a new factor on the political scene, and with people having no political record by which to judge, I threw myself open to questions in audiences that went from 3,000 to 30 in size. And it became apparent after a certain period of time that the first question that was going to be asked of me was with regard to the University of California at Berkeley.
The fact is, the students at Berkeley had created the issue, and Reagan began to shape a position about it. And when he became candidate for governor in a formal way on the 4th of January, 1966, he talked about the protest. And this is Reagan on what was happening at Berkeley.
My criticism of the administration at the time and of the administration of the university was that there seemed to be no action being taken except an action of complete retreat. And as a matter of fact, my predecessor on a number of occasions defended the things that were going on as being a worthwhile part of education. I hardly saw it that way. And that was why I said that, being on the outside, that I thought the answer might be a Blue Ribbon Citizens Committee to do some investigating and finding out. Well, with the change in presidents immediately after my coming into office, this became not the best thing to do. You couldn't go out seeking a new president while you were having an investigation going on. By this time, I don't think the investigation is required. We know what's going on in the campuses.
Back at the turn of the century, we embarked on a master plan of education. It was truly a bipartisan effort above political rivalry and differences. Its principal architects were a Democrat assemblywoman and a Republican assemblyman. Believing in that plan, Californians taxed themselves at a rate higher than any other Americans to build a great university. But it takes more than dollars in stately buildings. Or do we no longer think it necessary to teach self-respect, self-discipline, and respect for law and order? Will we allow a great university to be brought to its knees by a noisy dissident minority? Will we meet their neurotic vulgarities with vacillation and weakness? Or will we tell those entrusted with administering the university we expect them to enforce a code based on decency, common sense, and dedication to the high and noble purpose of that university? That they will have the full support of all of us as long as they do this, but we'll settle for nothing less.
Notice how unequivocal he is. We'll settle for nothing less. And he wanted them to enforce a code, to them being the university, based on decency, common sense, and dedication to the high and noble purpose of that university. That whole line explains the difference between the cowards and the left-wingers who today can't stand up to the students or to their own faculty. And in many cases, the faculty are even worse than the students. Now, Reagan originally thought they ought to have a Blue Ribbon Citizens Committee to investigating what was happening in the university. But after getting elected, he realized that was not the best way to approach it. On May 12, 1966, as a candidate, Reagan gave a speech at the Cow Palace in San Francisco. And the Cow Palace was the very famous auditorium where Barry Goldwater had been nominated 2 years earlier. Reagan, in that May 12 speech, talked about leadership and the decency gap at the University of California at Berkeley.
There, a small minority of beatniks, radicals, and filthy speech advocates have brought shame on a great university. So much so that applications for enrollment have dropped 21%, and there's evidence they'll continue to drop even more. Now, we've all read the press reportings of the report that was handed in by the Senate subcommittee, and its charges that the campus has become a rallying point for communists and a center for sexual misconduct. I've never seen that report. This is not only a sign of a leadership gap, or not the only sign. It began a year ago when the so-called free speech advocates, who in truth have no appreciation for freedom, were allowed to assault and humiliate the symbol of law and order, a policeman on the campus. And that was the moment when the ringleaders should have been taken to the scruff of the neck and thrown out of the university once and for all.
When you think about Reagan's description of a leadership gap, and you look, for example, at Columbia University, you know exactly how parallel these things are. You have presidents of universities who are intimidated by their faculty, intimidated by their students, who are intimidated by foreign donors, and we're just now beginning to realize how much money is coming into these universities from foreign countries. And by the way, not being reported even though they're legally required to. So Reagan decided to take the university head on. And in January 1967, shortly after getting sworn in as governor, Reagan proposed a plan which would cut the budget of the University of California by 20% and start requiring tuition payments. At the time, the students only had to pay $135 a year in fees. Now, on the Reagan plan, the tuition charge would be $400 a year with an additional $275 a year for in-state students. But it would be $940 a year with additional fees for out-of-state students. In Reagan's mind, this was a state university and therefore was focused on the students of the state of California. Even under the Reagan plan, free tuition for some students would still be available, but only for in-state students. On January 17, 1967, still in his very first month as governor, Governor Reagan issued a written statement on his plan to raise tuition and cut the university budget. In that statement, he said the following, and I'm quoting Governor Reagan: "As plainly as we can, we have told the citizens of the state the nature and size of our financial problem. We're trying through economies of roughly 10% to effect savings somewhat in excess of $200 million, and will strive for more. But even so, a part of the deficit will have to be made up from new revenues. At the same time, we must provide a margin for a new, broader-based tax to relieve the overburdened property taxpayer, principally the homeowner. Every segment of government must share in the economies first, as every citizen must share in the increased taxes. Education and welfare total 80% or more of the general fund spending. There is no way we could exempt them from the belt-tightening that is necessary. If we did, we'd have to eliminate all other government services to arrive at any meaningful reduction." So Reagan was putting education, which had been up to then almost a sacred institution, he was putting it right in line with having to get to a balanced budget and to control the spending by the state. Now, the president of the University of California, Clark Kerr, was a very famous national figure. He'd been at the university for 22 years, was so opposed to what Reagan was doing that on January 20th, 1967, still in Reagan's first month as governor, he was fired by a vote of 14-8. That also happened to be the first Board of Regents meeting that Governor Reagan attended. However, the vote happened in a closed session an hour after Reagan left to catch a plane to Los Angeles. Kerr had been very vocal against Reagan's plan to cut funding and enact tuition for the university, and he'd been very unwilling to take control of the university back from the students. The lead story the next day, on January 21st, 1967, in the San Francisco Chronicle read, "UC Regents fire Kerr. Big victory for Reagan." He was off to a serious start, beginning to take on Berkeley and the problems of a university that was out of control. On January 22nd, 1967, Regent Theodore Meyer issued a statement published in the San Francisco Chronicle. Quote, "Kerr's relations with the regents were adversely affected by his handling of the Berkeley campus disorders in the fall of 1964. Some subsequent events did not improve the relationship. The resulting uncertainty and controversy have been harmful to the university in many ways." Now notice, on the one hand, he's following a pattern of being within the game, doing what seems to be appropriate, not overruling the regents. On the other hand, he is setting a tone and a framework where the regents are doing what Reagan hoped would happen. Now, that initial approach did not automatically solve anything. Over the course of 1968, 2 California highway patrolmen were firebombed during the June 28th to July 3rd riots. Officers suffered serious burns, with one returning to limited duty. A newly constructed building near the campus was bombed, which blew a 12 by 16-foot hole in the building and broke a water pipe. A guardhouse on Berkeley campus was bombed. The ROTC building on campus was bombed. An attempted bombing of a Berkeley police car in the police station parking lot. It would have blown up the car and several buildings if the bomb had worked, but it didn't. An explosion at a utility company tower near campus. 2 bombing attempts at nearby industrial plants. Neither of the bombs worked. Law enforcement confiscated over 1,000 sticks of dynamite, more than 200 guns and other weapons, dozens of Molotov cocktails and materials used to make them in apartments or cars in and around the Berkeley campus. There were about a dozen arson attempts in Berkeley, causing at least $800,000 in damage over 7 months. Berkeley officials were forced to declare a state of civil disaster during riots taking place on June 30th to July 3rd, 1968, and August 30th to September 9th, 1968. In both cases, outside police officers were brought in. During the protest, 1 officer was shot and survived, and dozens more were fired on. The summer riots of 1968 cost at least $250,000 in property damage. Additionally, there were financial losses for local businesses and the cost of increased police presence has never been reported. Notice, by the way, that this was a very violent period. Nationwide, the FBI estimated that in 1969 to 70, there were 2,500 bombings. The level of militancy we're beginning to see now, if it is not stopped, grows and frankly becomes almost like a cancer and getting more violent, more dangerous. The people who are the hardcore become even harder, and they gradually turn to levels of violence that at the beginning seemed inconceivable. The campus draft opposition planned on May 17, 1968, to hold an anti-draft Vietnam commencement at the University of California. The campus draft opposition was a registered campus organization with both students and faculty members. And interestingly, we now have had Senator Bernie Sanders say that with all the student demonstrations, with what's coming up this summer in Chicago, where, remember, in 1968, there were huge demonstrations, and the police ended up using tear gas, and the country was horrified during the Democratic National Convention in 1968 to see the speeches inside and the riots outside. Well, Senator Sanders just said it's possible that Gaza and the war are going to become for President Biden what Vietnam was for President Johnson. It was pretty sobering comments by Senator Sanders, and worth keeping in mind as you look at the parallels back with how Reagan dealt with it. The anti-war effort, Vietnam commencement, was planned to be held on the steps of Sproul Hall because the organization was denied the use of the 10,000-seat Greek theater on campus by U.S. District Judge William T. Swigert, who refused to order the university to let them use the theater. More than 700 Berkeley students who were refusing to sign up for the draft planned on attending. Governor Reagan was vocally against this and said that he hoped the regents would ask University President Charles J. Hitch to cancel the event. Reagan warned that unless the regents called off the event, quote, "I will review my options for other action." Reagan also noted that any demonstration against the draft and that encouraged students to not sign up should be considered treason. May 10, 1968, Reagan, in a letter to Theodore Meyer, chairman of the Board of Regents, wrote that Berkeley administrators should revoke the group's official campus registration and discipline any faculty member involved. 6,000 university students and faculty attended the hour-long Vietnam commencement anyways, ignoring the ban. Several hundred in attendance pledged to refuse military service and signed "I won't go" statements. They were in effect publicly pledging to break the law. Students chanted, "As long as the United States is involved in this war, I will not serve in the armed forces." The organizers argued that it was not a Vietnam commencement, despite a banner which said it was, but that it was an anti-draft rally, which they had permission to have. Regent board members stated that it was an example of free expression in an orderly setting, and refused to have disciplinary measures against the students and faculty in attendance. In June, Reagan suggested that the Board of Regents have a special University of California report that looked into how Regents' policy is implemented. Reagan said at a news conference, quote, "I intend to promote the ideas suggested before, that I think the Regents should have a staff, a small staff of their own, reporting directly to the Regents on the implementation of Regents' policy and to make sure that policy is being carried out in various campuses." By the way, this is a theme that we'll see again and again, because over and over again you have people at the very top who are elected find out that they can't enforce their will, they can't get things done, and that the bureaucracy simply ignores them or subverts what they want. Now, Reagan had come to realize that he had to be as tough as he needed to be to quell the situation, to bring about peace and safety, and to enforce the law. February 5th, 1969, he declared a state of extreme emergency at the request of local officials during violence connected with the Third World Liberation Front strike at the University of California, Berkeley. According to a New York Times article, Reagan authorized H.W. Sullivan, Commissioner of the California Highway Patrol, to provide all necessary manpower and aid to Sheriff Frank Madigan of Alameda County to maintain order on the campus. The state of emergency read, quote, "Any student suspended or expelled from a state university, college, junior college, or high school who afterward entered the property of a public educational institution without permission of the chief campus officer or his representative would be guilty of criminal trespass. Any student convicted of criminal offense growing out of a campus disturbance would be dismissed and could not enter a state school or college for at least 1 year. Any faculty member or other employee of a college or university or a similar offense in these circumstances would be dismissed and become ineligible for further employment at a state college or school without specific permission of the governing board. It would be illegal to bring a loudspeaker on any campus without official permission. Now, these are clear, specific steps that every university could take and that probably they have to take if they're going to get control back of the campuses today. Now, despite having issued these very strong position in the state of emergency, things continued to decay, and as of February 21st, 1969, a total of 125 adults and 2 juveniles were arrested during the Third World Liberation Front strike, which started in the Berkeley campus on January 22, 1969. Of that number, 88 were students, 34 were not students, 2 were faculty members, and 3 were non-teaching employees of the university. And notice, by the way, that we're getting increasing reports that maybe as much as half of the people involved in the incidents on campus who are being arrested, up to half of them, are not in fact students and don't belong on the campus in the first place. In Reagan's era, of the students, 1 was dismissed, 11 were on interim suspension, 60 faced disciplinary hearings, and 39 were under investigation for possible disciplinary hearings. 28 of the non-students who were previously students were barred for readmission at the university. During a press conference on February 20th, 1969, Reagan said, "I do not feel the university has matched us with a determination to help us effectively." He went on, Governor Reagan, at the University of California Berkeley Board of Regents meeting on February 21st, 1969, demanded that striking students be expelled and faculty be fired. We're seeing what real leadership from somebody who's committed to restoring order can really look like. Outside of the February 21st, 1969 Board of Regents meeting, about 3,000 railed outside protesting, and as the San Francisco Chronicle wrote, shouted on printable epithets directed against Governor Reagan. All of this continued to build. The People's Park protest, May 15th to June 2nd, was the 4th major riot at Berkeley in less than a year. What happened was an undeveloped area that was now slated for development became a symbol for the left-wing students, and they decided that they were going to, in fact, occupy the park. The People's Park was just a blank space, was becoming a real problem for the police, beginning in May of 1969. During April 28th to May 14th, 1969, police received 48 formal complaints of incidents happening in the park. The university decided to put up a fence around the park to keep out unwanted individuals, while the university surveyed the area and prepared for previously planned development. On May 14th, Berkeley University posted no trespassing signs around People's Park in Berkeley. Demonstrators took down the 51 signs and burned them in a fire pit. Later that day, about 350 people gathered at the park. 75 people brought sleeping gear and blankets to occupy the site overnight. About 275 officers were sent from the Berkeley Police Department, Alameda County Sheriff's Office, and the California Highway Patrol. On May 15, 1969, at 4:45 a.m., police informed the crowd that they were trespassing and were told to leave or be arrested. Only about a dozen stayed. Most of the crowd left. 3 people were arrested. At 6:20 a.m., a construction crew went to the site to build a fence around the park to prevent people from occupying it. About 100 people showed up, but did not intervene with the construction, so the police made no attempt at arresting them. A group of students addressed the crowd, telling them that a mass protest was to take place at noon on the Sproul Hall Plaza. By noon, about 2,000 people gathered at Sproul Hall Plaza, including people not affiliated with the college. At the start of the noon protest, 159 officers, 37 Berkeley police, 26 sheriff's deputies, and 100 California Highway Patrol were on duty. Various speeches took place, ending with the UC student body president Daniel Siegel saying, quote, "If we are to win this thing, it is because we are making it more costly for the university to put up its fence than it is for them to take down the fence. Let's go and take over the park. The group of 2,000 then started advancing to People's Park, where the construction crew was still putting up the fence. Violence ensued. Rocks, sticks, bricks, pieces of pipe were thrown at the officers. Cherry bombs began exploding on the streets. Protests broke local business windows, vandalized police cars. At 12:52 p.m., officers began throwing tear gas containers in the crowd in hopes to contain them and to protect themselves. The officers were unable to control the violence, and other officers arrived at 2:15. By that evening, at least 103 officers were injured, 22 businesses had their windows smashed, and an unknown number of police cars were damaged. At 9 p.m., Governor Reagan signed a proclamation declaring a national emergency, calling the National Guard at the request of local and state law enforcement. The Berkeley City Council voted 8-1 against sending in the National Guard. Reagan ignored them and sent the Guard anyway. During the period of May 15th to 24th, there were a total of 768 arrests, 272 university students and 496 non-university students, almost a 2-1 margin of non-students. About 40% of those arrested were not residents of the town of Berkeley and came from out of town. According to a report published on July 1st, 1969, to Governor Reagan, detailing the People's Park confrontation, the cost of maintaining the National Guard support forces at Berkeley was estimated by the Department of Finance at almost $50,000 a day. The troops were withdrawn on June 2nd, making a total of 17 days' duty. A preliminary estimate of the cost was $764,000 for the National Guard expenses. And remember, this is in $1969, so you'd have to multiply by 3 or 4 to get to a current cost. In an April 17th, 1970 press conference, a university spokesman accused Reagan of escalating the situation by bringing in the National Guard. Reagan responded,
First of all, the police have a very difficult role. I think that every doubt should be resolved in their favor. At the same time, as a citizen, if you throw a rock at me, I have no right to use a gun back at you. It's this escalation of force that we've got to stop. President Nixon has said that we've got to lower our voices. What I find is that Governor Reagan and some of the police activity, not all of it, most of it is excellent, but some of it is escalating. As I've said before, that instead of throwing water in these situations and quieting them down, I find certain individuals in our public life are throwing kerosene and making the situation worse. We're going to get somebody killed if it isn't stopped.
There's some key things that we have to recognize. One is that the problems we're facing today go back a long way. Reagan thoroughly understood that. In fact, in a May 12, 1970 speech at the San Francisco Hilton, he suggested that students are being indoctrinated in college campuses.
I have a terrible suspicion that if we really could open the door on higher education, we would find that our young people, many of them, have been indoctrinated in thousands of social science courses, not to find it the way it is, but to believe it the way it isn't. That they have been indoctrinated with one viewpoint regarding our system. When students tell me that the capitalistic system must go, and these are not rioting students, these are good students.
I think it's very important that we understand that Reagan recognized the core problems we're now dealing with. If you look at his farewell address in January 1989, he warns that we are failing to protect American citizenship, we're failing to teach American history, and that we have a great problem growing among our young people. Well, that's just metastasized over and over again, and we are today faced with not yet as big a problem, not yet as violent a problem, but clearly a growing challenge of people who are overtly anti-American, people who chant death to America, people who chant death to Israel, clear, open, vivid anti-Semitism, and a dramatically greater influence from foreign governments who have given billions of dollars to the very universities whose leaders are now afraid to defend America and afraid to defend the rule of law. I think you can learn a lot about Governor Ronald Reagan's approach to student protest. We have it on our show page at newtsworld.com. Certainly if you go to the Reagan Library, the amount of material they have is astounding. Governor Reagan and then President Reagan were always clear, always firm, and always willing to stand up for what he believed in. I think it's very important for us to recognize that we once again are at the hinge of history. We once again have to stand up for freedom, for America, for citizenship, for the rule of law, and that Reagan is a pretty good guide for how to do that. I want to thank you for listening. We can learn more about Governor Reagan's approach to student protesters on our show page at newtsworld.com. Newt's World is produced by Gingrich 360 and iHeartMedia. Our executive producer is Garner Z. Sloan, and our researcher is Rachel Peterson. The artwork for the show was created by Steve Penley. Special thanks to the team at Gingrich 360. If you've been enjoying Newt's World, I hope you'll go to Apple Podcast and both rate us with 5 stars and give us a review so others can learn what it's all about. Right now, listeners of Newt's World can sign up for my 3 free weekly columns at gingrich360.com/newsletter. I'm Newt Gingrich. This is Newt's World.